You have just released fresh data on the state of open source in Europe. Europe has always been a hub of open source innovation, from the kernel to MySQL and so many other technologies. From your perspective, what are the key highlights of this report? What stood out even for you?
I have to say it's been a data heavy last couple of weeks at the Linux Foundation. To your point, we released the World of Open Source report, but we also released our commercial open source report for the first time in partnership with some European VC. We recently hired a chief economist at the Linux Foundation who has published previously a lot of data from Harvard Business School, Frank Nagel. So it's been a flurry of data that is really being, I think, very helpful, especially, I think, we hope for communities out there, but also for me as, we shape the direction of Linux Foundation Europe. Back to the report is the third year that we run a regional specific what we call World of Open Source report. This year was titled, based on its conclusions, open source as Europe's strategic advantage. And there are a couple of points that really stood out for me. First and foremost, we continue to see open source as a more and more recognized as a strategic lever for Europe's, economy, geopolitical balances. So it's going way beyond technology. If you talk to European experts, it's really it's elevated from a technical consideration to a strategic lever for digital sovereignty. It was one of the main sort of top line, I think, outcomes from the report. That being said, there is a gap. There is a gap between, what's perceived as valuable in open source by sort of the practitioners, those of us, who lived in the bubble, as well as sort of the general technologists. With relatively fewer executives, understanding sort of the strategic values of open source. I think, there was about 20-30% gap. I think 80% of employees would recognize its strategic value, only about 60% of executives. So we think that's certainly a gap to work on. And then, last but not least, I think there are lessons for the open source community itself. There were a lot of feedback that we got both in qualitative and quantitative interviews as to how open source communities should and could better engage with policymakers. We live in the European, sort of in the era of regulated open source. If you think about, especially in Europe, the Cyber Resiliency Act, the AI Act, there continue to be regulations that impact technology and therefore open source, given that open source makes up from 80 to 90% of technology. And so there's certainly a call from the open source community in Europe for stewards and foundations like us to better engage and I would say earlier engage with policymakers in upcoming regulation. And that's something that we're certainly quite focused on as Linux Foundation Europe.